Did Rush become more radio-friendly with their album Permanent Waves in 1980? Back in the late 70s, Rush was at a turning point. They had already written some progressive rock masterpieces with albums like 2112 and Hemispheres, but it was time for them to adapt to the new decade. This is the story of Permanent Waves, an album that blended their progressive rock roots with a fresh, radio-friendly edge, proving that change doesn't mean compromise. But how did this record come together, and why is it still celebrated 45 years later? I will be talking about all of that in this video, so let me get into it. Rush had reached their progressive rock peak in the late 70s with the 3-album run of 2112, A Farewell to Kings, and Hemispheres. These albums featured big progressive rock compositions with songs featuring long runtimes. But it was the start of a new decade, the 80s. So they decided to adapt their next album to current trends, and that is shown on their album Permanent Waves. This is their 7th studio album. It was released on January 14th, 1980. It's also celebrating 45 years. Some of the changes included more radio-friendly songs and concise arrangements, but they didn't completely abandon their progressive rock sound, as there were still a few longer tracks that had a sound that was reminiscent of their previous albums. They were just going through a natural progression that we would see on subsequent albums such as Moving Pictures and Signals. The story begins in June of 1979. The band had just finished an 8-month tour of North America and Europe while supporting their previous album called Hemispheres from 1978. The band was tired and they were suffering from burnout. So this was the first time in the band's history that each member decided to take a 6-week break before starting on a new album. So the band decided to get back together sometime during the summer of 1979, and they met at Lake Woods Farm, which is near Flesherton, Ontario, and their intention was to write and rehearse new material for the next 2 weeks. So the band decided to set up their equipment in the basement, and the first thing they did was just record this big instrumental mishmash during the first session as a way to get back into the swing of things. There were parts of this big song that were used as parts of older songs. So eventually they began preparing for the first 3 songs, which were Spirit of Radio, Free Will, and Jacob's Ladder. Some of the songs were shorter, more concise, and more radio-friendly, although according to Neil Peart, he said that it wasn't a conscious decision, it was just how it came out. They eventually moved to a different studio in northern Ontario in Toronto, and they got together with their producer, Terry Brown, for their final recordings, and they also prepared for the next tour, where they played The Spirit of Radio and Free Will. Now it's September of 1979. Rush go into another studio, which is in Warren Heights, Quebec, and they get ready to record the album with their producer, Terry Brown, and engineer Paul Northfield. So the band recorded the album with multiple takes, just so they can get the best performance, and then they started doing overdubs. After they completed the album, they prepared the album cover artwork, which consisted of a photo taken by Flip Schulke of the Galveston seawall in Texas during Hurricane Carla, which took place back in September of 1961. You see a woman on the album cover, and she is a Canadian model. Her name is Paula Turnbull. She's also featured on their live album Exit Stage Left. And the man waving in the background is the man who designed the album cover, Hugh Syme. It's time to release the album. It was released on January 14, 1980, and it did very well. It reached number 3 in Canada, in the UK, and number 4 in the US, and was certified platinum in the US 2 months after its release. Now let me talk more about the album. All the lyrics were written by Neil Peart, with the exception of Different Strings, which was written by Geddy Lee, and all music was written by Geddy Lee and Alex Lifeson. The album has 6 songs with 3 tracks on each side. It's a fairly short album, clocking in at 36 minutes. The first song is Spirit of Radio. This one has lyrics written by Neil Peart. In an interview he did back in 1980, he said it was about a specific radio station called CFNY-FM, which is in Toronto. It was something that he was listening to on a regular basis. The lyrics were about his personal experience with the radio. So for example, when he would wake up in the morning, he would turn on the radio. The song did pretty well. It was their first top 30 single in Canada and reached 51 on the US Billboard Hot 100. According to Alex Lifeson, he said that the opening guitar riff was something he wanted to make that almost sounded like radio waves bouncing around. And there's one thing very noticeable on the song is that they start using reggae sounds, which is something they would be doing on their next 3 albums, which would be Moving Pictures, Signals, and Grace Under Pressure. It was something they had been thinking of doing for a while. They even used to do this reggae-influenced guitar riff before playing their song Working Man in a live setting, so it's probably one of their most popular songs on the album. The next song is Free Will. This was written by Neil Peart, and basically about the concept of free will and the choices people make. In that same interview, he mentioned that he's interested in things like mysticism, astrology, and religion, so it was a concept he was interested in. He's also a big fan of the TV show The Twilight Zone, and he's interested in fantasy and science fiction books, so a lot of this was influential in his writing. This song is the second track. It's a popular song, although it was never released as a single, but it has appeared on various compilations. It was one of the songs that's played on the radio often. According to Alex Lifeson, he said the guitar solo was really hard to play and one of the most ambitious guitar solos. And the song was also one of the last songs where Geddy Lee would sing in his high range, which is very common with his albums in the 70s. So his vocal style started to change around the same time of the song. And although it's a radio rock song, it's still a progressive rock song, which features odd time signatures. The third song on side 1 is Jacob's Ladder. This was more of a progressive rock song. It was very reminiscent of the work of the 70s. Neil Peart wrote the lyrics using the Bible as a reference. Although he claimed not to be religious, he grew up in a religious background. The idea of Jacob's Ladder had 2 different meanings. The first is a natural phenomenon where you can see the clouds and the sun, and it shows beams of light that's coming down. And you can see it here. I use the image in the thumbnail, and have it on the screen as well. But Jacob's Ladder was also something used in the Bible, and refers to a part of the Bible where Jacob saw angels ascending and descending in a vision. In other words, it was like a ladder to heaven. This is one of the more progressive rock songs that also has elements of heavy metal music. It's also one of the longer songs at 7.5 minutes and considered a classic. So as we get to side 2 in the album, it begins with a song called Entre, which means Between Us in French. This was also released as a single and the title taken from Ayn Rand's 1943 novel called The Fountainhead. In an interview with Neil Peart back in 1980, he said it was meant to be about personal relationships, whether being male-female or male-male relationships, and on a larger scale, social relationships in general, whether if they're groups of people or subdivisions in society. Basically, the song's about how people have a hard time understanding each other, even if it's a person that you have known for a long time. There are times when you just don't know what they're thinking, so that was the idea behind the song. The next song is called Different Strings, which is written by Geddy Lee. Out of all the songs on the album, it's probably the one that gets talked about the least, but I think it's an interesting song. It's a softer acoustic ballad. Geddy Lee sings in a softer style. The lyrics talk about slaying the dragon, which is now more of a metaphor, but it's basically about 2 people who grow apart, or at least that's my interpretation of the lyrics. The last song was called Natural Science. This is a classic late 70s style progressive rock song. It's the longest song on the album at 9 minutes and 20 seconds. Although slightly shorter than some of their epics on previous albums, it's still divided into 3 different parts, with one part being called Tide Pools, Part 2, Hyperspace, and Part 3, Permanent Waves. The song is very deep, and on the one hand, it's about the scientific world, but the main idea is that there's this relationship between man and nature. It was something that had to be tamed in order to survive. This also deals with the concept of science, where people don't understand it, and they're afraid of it, and it's a song about the awareness in people's minds about what science is and how it can get out of hand. So, in conclusion, was this a new chapter for Rush? Yeah, I would say it's one of their transitional albums, because the Rush discography can be separated into different parts. There's the first 2 albums being hard rock, the next couple albums being progressive rock, and then this album, Permanent Wave, started that transitional period, which would include both Moving Pictures and Signals. And then with Grace Under Pressure, they started a completely different period with more of those synthesizer sounds, and then they changed again with Presto and so on. So it's a transitional album. Actually, one of my favorites. I think it's one of their best, because it kind of has the best of both worlds. It has a little bit of that 70s and a little bit of their 80s stuff. So let me know in the comments, what's your favorite track from Permanent Waves? Do you think this was Was it their turning point? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, share, subscribe for more rock and metal album reviews, breakdowns, and things like that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.